Usually when a wrestler's been gone for a period of time, they can at least count on the fact their return will be a big moment. After all, fans like to see someone come back after an absence because it reminds them of why they love these people in the first place. That said, such a reality is not always the case. No, for every Triple H in 2002 or CM Punk in 2021, there are other returns which have since gone forgotten. But what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, so join us as we take a deep dive into Failure to Make a Memory, Wrestling's Forgotten Returns. And if we're going to start anywhere today, let's do so by picking a timely example, as our first subject is someone who recently made another return to the ring in AEW. That said, for as memorable as both this and his 2021 re-debuts were, most people have now forgotten that CM Punk actually first came back to wrestling in 2019 as part of WWE Backstage. Yes, he never actually laced up his boots here, as it was a talk show designed to promote WWE TV, one which also featured other company employees such as Renee Young, Paige, and Booker T. Still, when it was revealed that Instagram Phil had made a deal to start appearing on the show in November of that year, it was a shock move, to say the least. But then, how could it be anything else when the Second City Saints' exit from New York had been such a bitter one? So bitter, in fact, it was assumed he'd never have anything to do with Vince McMahon again, especially after the boss fired him on his wedding day. That said, there was a loophole which made it easier for Punk to accept a job on this panel show, as it wasn't actually being produced by WWE themselves. No, instead, it would be produced by Fox, SmackDown's TV network, meaning that he wouldn't technically be working for his old employer again. Still, it was pretty close to a New York return in many fans' eyes, and had it gone on for longer, who knows where it would have led to. Unfortunately though, as a result of poor ratings, the show was cancelled in mid-2020, leaving Chicago's favorite son to have to find another way to deal with the wrestling bug he was starting to feel once again. And we all know what happened after that: a triumphant debut at the First Dance, a 5-star feud with MJF, a brief AEW World title run, then a brawl with the Elite which led to everyone involved being suspended. Honestly, with all that's gone on involving Punk in the last few years, it's easy to see why his first return for WWE Backstage has since been overshadowed. Of course, when it comes to our next subject though, it's not as if there's been a constant source of drama to make everyone collectively lose their memories of his 2018 return to New York. And in the end, that only goes to show how forgettable it was when Jonathan Coachman briefly came back to Raw to man their commentary booth. What's the word of the hour? Momentum. Or if you're the coach, the Big Mo. Yes, this was the kind of dire material fans were being treated to each and every week when the Kansas native decided it was time to reintroduce himself to wrestling audiences towards the end of the 2010s. To be fair though, it wasn't as if Coach was great during his first run either. No, he was always a bit of a B-tier commentator. So that was exactly why, after only a few months in the booth, in September of that year, Coachman would be replaced by Renee Young and instead moved over to the role of pre-show panel host for pay-per-views. So really, for that reason, the Jonathan Coachman return can't be seen as anything less than a failure. But at least people are still watching him do his thing, which is more than can be said for the situation Road Warrior Animal found himself in during 2001 WCW when he made a return that no one remembers now. Why is this? Well, because it was during a period when almost everyone had tuned out of the Atlanta product on account of a year of some of the worst booking in the history of the industry, bringing things to an all-time low level. So in a last-ditch attempt to make fans care once more then, the decision was made to bring in a mystery man as the enforcer of the heel group named the Magnificent Seven. And this mystery man's identity would be built up so much throughout January of that year, it would even lead to speculation amongst audiences that a top name from WWF might even be about to jump ship and turn the fortunes of the company around in the process. But such a thing never happened in the end, because rather than a Steve Austin or The Rock making his debut at Sin, it was instead the return of Road Warrior Animal which fans were treated to. And we say treated to with a healthy dose of sarcasm here, because while the Road Warriors may be the greatest tag team of all time and were no doubt megastars during the 80s and 90s, come 2001, Animal was a shadow of his former self. Obviously then, no one batted an eyelid when he was revealed as being the surprise return to the company on this show. And given WCW would go out of business just 2 months later, it meant the whole thing has largely gone forgotten to history in the years since. Seriously, if you ask anyone to run through the Road Warriors' career, even their biggest fans might struggle to remember the 2001 period. Still, at least it isn't as forgettable as the return another 80s star had in 2005 when Jim Duggan re-debuted in WWE to pretty much zero fanfare. Sure, we know Hacksaw wasn't exactly the top guy in New York during the Golden Era, but he was always someone positioned at a high mid-card level on account of his ability to get over with fans, and prior to that, he actually had been a top draw on the territory circuit when he worked alongside the likes of Ted DiBiase, Magnum TA, and the Junkyard Dog over in Mid-South Wrestling. Hell, he even holds the distinction of being the winner of the first ever Royal Rumble in 1988. So if nothing else, you'd think that for this reason alone, fans would have been excited to see him again when he came back in the mid-2000s. But as it turned out, at this point, audiences had moved on to other favorites, and so instead of being overjoyed when that familiar "Ho!" rang out on the October 3rd, 2005 edition of Raw, they instead went mild. And it didn't get much better for Duggan following this, because after deciding to stick around for a while longer in order to become a mentor to Eugene, he quickly realized no one was interested in what he was selling anymore. But that's a shame really, because it wasn't like Duggan didn't do some good stuff during his latter run. In fact, aside from teaming with Eugene and then later feuding with him as well, he'd also get into a fairly decent program with Edge, which saw the rated R superstar further raise his stock within the company. That said, on account of the lack of interest surrounding the whole return at the time, few will remember this at all today. No, for most people, Hacksaw's mid-2000s full-time return never took place, and instead, he remains as he was during the Golden Era in their minds. Of course, Jim Duggan wasn't the only star of the 80s who later struggled to recapture the same magic when he came back to WWE decades after the fact, and we can say this for certain, because in 2010, right at the point the company was in the depths of a pretty bad period, it was decided the best thing to do in order to turn everyone's fortunes around was to bring in Virgil. Yes, Virgil. The man who, while he may briefly have been a star in the late 80s and early 90s WWF, is far better known today as what happens when a performer from the past goes on the convention circuit and fails to draw any interest. So really, it should come as no surprise to anyone then that, when he returned to WWE on the May 7th, 2010 edition of Raw, he was forgotten as soon as he walked through the curtain. But let's backtrack for a moment, because we first need to look at why Virgil got over at all during the Golden Era. Basically, after spending years as the put-upon manservant of the $1 Million Man, someone who was regularly asked to humiliate himself by doing things like cleaning his employer's shoes on national television, the lover of meat sauce and Olive Garden breadsticks finally decided that he'd had enough when, in January of 1991, he turned on DiBiase and challenged him to a match. How would the subsequent feud go for the Pennsylvania native? Pretty good, as it turned out, because by August 26th SummerSlam, he'd have become the new $1 Million champion. Sadly though, after that victory, Virgil fell pretty hard as his lack of charisma and ring skills led fans to quickly realize they weren't actually interested in him as a main eventer at all. So with it becoming clear his time in New York had peaked then, by the mid-90s, Virgil would have made the jump over to WCW, where he became the lackey of the NWO. And once his run was over there, he gradually transformed into the man he's better known as today, a carny of the highest level who's always ready to offer an autograph for a price. That said, while this may have made him a bit of an ironic meme online, it wasn't enough to get fans to care when he returned to his old role of manservant on a PG-era Raw, this time for Ted DiBiase Jr., the son of his former employer. And sure, part of the reason for that was because no one cared about Ted DiBiase Jr. either, but the situation certainly wasn't helped by the fact that once people got their initial laughs out of the way, the joke died hard. Maybe this was why Virgil was eventually replaced with Maurice then, leaving him to return back to the convention circuit from whence he came, where he continued to ply his trade as wrestling superstar. Still, at least Soul Train Jones can rest easy in the knowledge he's not the only manager wrestler who went completely forgotten when he returned to the former role at a time well after his peak was over. And if you need proof of that, you only need to look to Mr. Hughes' WWF comeback in 1999 as the manager of Chris Jericho. Yes, it wasn't as if Hughes had lit the world on fire with his previous runs in WWF, WCW, and ECW between 1990 and 1998, where he'd been a dependable mid-card enforcer for the likes of Lex Luger, Harvey Whippleman, and Shane Douglas, but that didn't mean he wasn't a name with at least some degree of recognition. Hell, in 1997, he'd even make a brief return to New York when he served as a pre-China enforcer for Hunter Hearst Helmsley, even if this wasn't exactly a memorable run in itself. That said, the failure of such a run was nothing compared to the following time he'd show up on WWF TV, as this happened just 2 years later when Chris Jericho was on the lookout for a new bodyguard. That's right, after an all-time great debut, Y2J was struggling to establish himself in his new home. So in order to help him do this then, he felt the best decision he could make would be to get some muscle behind him. And the man he chose for the role of this muscle was none other than Mr. Hughes, though if you've forgotten such a thing ever happened, we wouldn't exactly blame you. And that's because the whole thing only lasted for a few weeks before Jericho decided to kick the Kansas City native to the curb after feeling like he wasn't pulling his weight. But then we guess not everyone can be Ralphus, can they? No, in this case, Mr. Hughes was destined to fail from day one, as the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla didn't really need a manager. All he needed instead was a microphone and 5 minutes to show exactly why he was a superstar. But some wrestlers do need a manager to help them get over, as their mic skills aren't exactly their strong point. And on 2016 SmackDown, few people needed help in this department more than Darren Young, which was exactly why Bob Backlund was brought in to guide him going forward. Of course, this one should have been a home run, as aside from holding the WWF World title for 1,470 days in the late 70s and early 80s, and serving as the bridge between Bruno Sammartino and Hulk Hogan, Backlund had also gone through something of a second life when he returned to New York in the mid-90s, and there created his crazy old man character. So with him having the talents both in the ring and on the mic then, it seemed obvious he'd be able to help get the former primetime player to the next level, something he set about doing in May of that year when he took up the role of the youngster's life coach during a series of skits. Yes, Bob Backlund's goal was simple: to make Darren Young great again. Unfortunately though, for one reason or another, this just never clicked with fans at the time. And that meant as the weeks went on and the former world champion tried his best to motivate his protege, audiences just didn't seem to care. So when Young got injured in 2017 and then released from his contract later that same year, it left Backlund with nowhere else to go other than back into the background, where people could forget he'd ever made his brief return. Sure, given how much potential this one had as a revival of his mid-90s get off my lawn gimmick, you could argue that it was a tragedy it never went any further. But what about another All-American who made his return to New York around the same time? Surely he'd have a better go of it. After all, he was everything Vince McMahon wanted in a top guy. It's just a shame then that the Jack Swagger invasion of 2016 SmackDown didn't go down as well with anyone else, and because of that, it's since largely been forgotten. That said, Jack Swagger's run prior to 2016 is also largely gone forgotten, as the only real memorable moments which came from the entire thing were a tag team run with Cesaro and one of the worst World Heavyweight title reigns of all time. Still though, lots of people get better as they get more experienced, and come the middle of the 2010s, it was hoped that Swagger now had enough experience to prove himself as someone who could be a major player going forward. The only question was, with him by then only sporadically appearing on TV, would he get the opportunity to establish himself to such a level again? Well, the answer to that question came not long after the 2016 draft as it happened, because once it was revealed that the Fargo native's Raw contract was expiring, he became the first person to officially switch sides during this era, when on the October 4th episode of SmackDown, he formally signed on the dotted line with the Blue Brand. Yes, this was to be a moment when the future Bellator star finally proved he could be a top-level guy, and he would make that clear in his initial promo when he claimed he was going to be a big problem for the roster going forward. Cut to a couple of weeks later though, and it seemed like the Jack Swagger problem had been somewhat overblown, as after a brief feud with Baron Corbin, the big man was given his release from his contract, probably because WWE officials just didn't want to deal with the chaos he was causing anymore. Still, at least he would get to rebuild himself in some form when he went on to have a dual career in both an MMA cage and AEW ring over the years which followed, even if he's still largely seen as a lower card guy in the latter. And despite the fact no one really remembers the Jack Swagger problem era of SmackDown anymore today, he can always hold the distinction of saying he was technically the first man to jump brand lines during the mid-2010s. That said, if we go back to 2006, we'll find ourselves in a time where there wasn't just 2 WWE brands vying for supremacy. No, there were 3. And with ECW being the newest of them all at this point, it was deemed necessary to bring back some stars of the past in order to beef the roster up, which was exactly what led to Test making his debut there in July of that year. Sure, Andrew Martin had lost much of his luster over the years prior, as following the end of his kayfabe engagement to Stephanie McMahon, his career had plummeted into the depths of the mid-card. But that didn't mean there wasn't still something he had to offer. It's just a shame the place which was picked for him to showcase this did him absolutely no favors then. Why was that? Well, Extreme Championship Wrestling in its original form had always stood as the antithesis to Vince McMahon's vision of sports entertainment. After all, rather than be all about live-action cartoon characters and child-friendly storylines, it was more focused on a gang of outcasts and their often violent roads towards the top. So when the company was revived in 2006 under the zombie form of WWECW, fans were hopeful they'd at least get something which kept the original outlaw spirit of the brand. But in the end, what they got instead was more sports entertainment, as a series of WWE stars like Bobby Lashley, Hardcore Holly, and The Big Show became the de facto faces of the brand. And they weren't the only Vince McMahon guys who got a push here either, as once Test was re-signed, he'd report there too. Of course, this went down like a lead balloon with the Hardcore faithful, as the last thing they wanted to see on their Extreme TV show was the guy who had almost married the boss's daughter. Hell, even if the big man proved he still had something left in him during his early days in ECW, it wasn't enough to get anyone on his side. And so it was then that, in February of the following year, after having made approximately 0 memorable moments, Andrew Martin would once again be released from his contract after failing a wellness test. But what if a failed return doesn't lead to the company getting fed up and letting the performer go, rather than the exact opposite instead? Well, that's exactly what took place towards the end of the 2000s as it happened, because after realizing she was getting nowhere fast, Gail Kim finally decided it was time to quit right in the middle of a match. Let's rewind again for a second though, because it's important to add some context as to why the women's star was deemed worthy of being brought back at all. And the reason for this was because between 2002 and 2004, she was one of the best wrestlers on the WWE roster. And after that, once she jumped over to TNA, the Canadian would become a standout star of that promotion's Knockouts division. So much so, in fact, that really, it was her feud with Awesome Kong which represented the original women's revolution in North America, as it drew massive TV ratings for the time. Obviously then, after proving herself to be a star, it was a no-brainer Vince McMahon would want to bring Kim back into the fold in 2008. The only problem with this, though, was that by then, New York was deep into the Divas era, an era where it wasn't important how good a woman's wrestling promo or character were, rather it was about how much John Laurinaitis enjoyed looking at them in swimsuits. So for someone like the Toronto native, a performer who had always prided herself on her ability in the ring, this was about as bad of a situation as she could find herself in. And to make matters worse, because WWE fans had been so conditioned to see the women's division as little more than a titillation-themed sideshow at that point, it meant they'd have little time for her efforts at wowing them during matches. Not that she had much opportunity to do this anyway, as most of Kim's time over the next 3 years would be spent in things like dress-up divas battle royals, and with such matches not exactly letting her play to her strengths, it meant she'd quickly fade into the background, as many fans forgot she was even there. That said, they would remember her exit, as after growing frustrated with her spot, Kim finally decided to take matters into her own hands when, during a battle royal on the August 1st, 2011 episode of SmackDown, she eliminated herself from the match within the first minute, and then simply walked to the back. And this would be the last time she would ever be seen on WWE TV then, as following the incident, she'd quit the company and never return. So maybe the lesson to be learned here is that if you've been dealt a bad hand and given a pretty limp return which nobody cares about, you can at least make your exit a memorable one. And if that fails, then you can always hope a future return will work out better, as in the wrestling business, no doors are ever truly closed forever.